Hey, this is Dr. Corey Glenn, and I'm going to be showing in this video a recent denture case that we treated. So just to show you the end result before we even get into the video. On the left, you are seeing the third try-in on this patient, right? So I work at a charitable clinic, and a lot of times I'm not there all the time, so I jump in midstream on these cases, a lot of problematic cases. And she was a really tough patient to treat. The aesthetics were difficult to get. It was hard to get a repeatable bite on her, but nonetheless, they've gone through all the steps, and this is the third try-in. There's a disconnect with the lab. Things get told here we need to fix this, and it comes back and something else is different. And so, I was able to jump in on this case, and we took new impressions inside of these try-ins, which you see on the left, and just with that and some facial pictures, we were able to go to the denture that you see on the right the next time that I saw her. And, I think it's a drastic improvement. And so, dentures are full mouth rehabs, right? They're thought of as easy. They're not easy, right? They're full mouth rehab. You have to fully appreciate where the teeth belong in a face, centric video, all of these aspects that you have to get right if you're going to get a good result on a denture. And so, one of the ways I'm going to do that is through pictures. All right. So if I look at this picture, I'm going to show in this video how we can do some simple things like take it into PowerPoint, throw some lines on it, and make obvious what are the problems. So if you look at this picture, it's really clear to me. The teeth are undersized. The midline is shifted over to her right. There's a downhill slope going towards her left. There's all kinds of issues with this. I can tell from this picture that we need to bring the incisal edge out just slightly, that we've got a little bit of a reverse smile line, right? But these are things that are not, to me at least, obvious when I just look at them in the chair, and often not even when I just look at the pictures. It's not until I put these lines on it that things become clear. So again, the goal here is we want to get predictable, consistent results. And even though this is a denture case, you can take what I'm talking about here and apply it to anything and everything full arch. This could just as easily be the wax up for a full arch FP1 implant case, right? Again, I spend most of my time on an implant rehab doing the planning on where the teeth belong and getting the aesthetics right, then backtracking from that and saying, okay, well, here's where implants belong for that ideal result of teeth, all right? So, again, I hope you find this helpful. It's a long video, so buckle in. It's going to take a little while. But if you find some of this stuff helpful, if you're struggling to know how to do your full arch wax ups and translate that into dentures, full mouth rehabs, implant rehabs, all of those are just variations of the same theme. And I feel like I've gotten a pretty good grasp on how to consistently get those results. And it's not anything magical. I'm using some simple principles, things like pictures, stuff like that. So if you do find any of this stuff helpful that I'm talking about, I'm going to give a quick plug. Me and Danny are doing our advanced full arch guided surgery course, but it's not just about guided surgery. This is about full mouth treatment in general. This is about how to do diagnostic wax ups, how to diagnose, how to figure out the ideal end result before you ever start. So anyway, if you find that helpful, course is October 10th and 11th here at my farm in Tennessee. It's going to be a good time. We're going to go see some music at the caverns. Just go to coreyglenn.org and then click on this courses tab, and you'll see the advanced full arch course. And we would love to have you if you can make it. And with that said, we're going to jump midstream into how we actually approach this case and got a good result. So for starters, anytime that you've got a case where that is a problem, like you need to make some kind of aesthetic change, you got to take pictures. I can't stress enough how much you need pictures on everything. So I just took a few with my cell phone because I need something to reference when I'm trying to do the redesign on this. And so a good straight on facial picture, I'm going to go ahead and pull in, and I'm going to crop this picture down to what's relevant for my purposes, which is I need to see mainly just the face. And you could make your own of this, but this is just a PowerPoint template that I sell on the website on coreyglenn.org. I find this to be extremely useful in smile design and making things obvious as to what changes need to be made. So I've pulled in her facial picture. Now I'm going to say send to back. All right. And so if you notice, I've got all of these lines and everything already drawn in here. So let's make it full screen. And I always start with trying to align the facial midline behind these grids, right? Now, any of these little lines, they're clickable. I can use the arrows and slide them this way and that. But when I'm looking at facial midline, you're going to see almost every person you ever look at, their facial midline is going to be asymmetric with the nose. So the nose, to me, is not the best reference for this. All right, so what instead am I using? I'm usually using bridge of nose, all right, and then my lower reference point is the philtrum of the lip. All right, now she doesn't have a really well-defined philtrum of the lip, but you see how the design is just off with this? So, you know, I can do this one of two ways. I could either drag the line kind of this way and that. I'd rather not do that. I will probably go up here to picture format, rotate, and then under rotation options, that lets me now spin the picture a degree at a time. All right. You know, your other option is you could parallel to interpupillary. All right. So I can't even necessarily see her pupils, but that honestly, right where it is, the way I took it, looks like that's pretty parallel to her interpupillary. All right. So if I want to be square with her interpupillary line, I'm going to say about right there is kind of the best compromise. And again, there's some asymmetry, and you'll notice that if you ever take a picture on yourself and do this. Now, the reason I'm doing this is I want to make for myself a grid of like, okay, I can see where these teeth are, but I need to change that. This design is not working. And so I'm trying to make it obvious to myself, what are the problems and how do I remedy them? These two lines I use as a reference for intercanine. And so I'm either going to reference the width of the nose, or again, some patients have a really wide nose, you know, and maybe that's excessive. So your other reference that could be used is kind of the inner canthus of the eye. And when I say that, I don't mean this. I mean kind of where the whites of the eyes would meet up with the skin, you know, of your eyelids, right? And I'm going to get those in the ballpark. That looks pretty close to me. All right, so how, with this design, clearly, if this is the facial midline, we're off on that. All right, and then our canine, it's hard to even say, but it looks like the canine to canine could be scaled up for her face. All right, so that's nice to be able to know. This you don't have to do. This is a kind of a golden proportions ruler. And so you see how it's got red on midline and for inner canine lines. So what I'm going to do is just drag that and slide it around until it more or less corresponds to this. All right. And if these lines are asymmetric with their nose, remember she's got a little more nose on this side, you know, maybe I bump that in just a little bit. All right, so that's close enough. This line right here is just a parallel line to that. So if I'm trying to make her smile parallel to her interpupillary, this gives me a nice reference. Now, what do we think about the overall scaling of her teeth? All right, she's got a broad smile. She's probably going to show a little bit of gingiva no matter what if we put normal sized teeth in there. So if I've got a patient that doesn't show a lot of teeth, normally my starting point is I'll probably put incisal edge right about the wet dry line of the lip in their big smile. In a patient where they do have hypermobile lips and they show a lot, I tend to think of this, what's in between their lips, like a frame. And I'm usually going to take up 2/3 of that frame with maxillary teeth. And that looks good on most people. All right. And so now, by doing that, which took just a second, it wouldn't have taken as long as if me, you know, not talking here, but now I have this frame into which it's like, okay, this is kind of where teeth belong. Her centrals ought to fit in this frame. So incisal edge, I think, needs to come up some. I think the teeth, so even though I'm moving this, let's just look at the scaling of the teeth. They're not that bad. I think they could go a tiny bit wider with the width of those current teeth. And then, I think even if we slide this over, so canine to canine, I think these teeth are too narrow for her face, all right? And what else do I know? Well, it looks like there's a downhill cant going this way. All right, so that's a quick and dirty way that we can get to the bottom of, okay, these are the changes that we need to make, all right? So now with that done, what we did with this for the redesign is we went ahead and did a light body wash inside of this, all right? Got the wash, so we're gonna have a really nice tissue fit. You can see some little PBS remnants on there. And now we're going to take that back and scan that. So where I'm working there at that clinic, there's a desktop scanner. We went ahead and just took a new bite and upper and lower light body relines. Took it back there, scanned it real quick. And then as soon as we have that, now we have our data captured. And you could go ahead and let this patient go home with this denture, because we did finally kind of get her bite stabilized where she was going to the same place right here each time. So we don't want to change the bite. We're going to keep that. But we've got that data saved now. You could peel the PVS out, give this patient that denture, and say, all right, we're going to do a redesign on this. Use these until we get your final made. All right. So now I'm going to really do this one from A to Z. So this is going to be a long video. So when I'm not doing something that's, what I think is really important, I'll try to time lapse it. This was that lower impression scan. All right. So you can see that's my scan table. So I scanned this as a model. My starting point is going to be to clean this thing up and kind of make, what I'll call my master models out of this. So you can do this in Exocad, you can do this in Blue Sky, you can do this in Meshmixer. It's really up to you, whatever program you feel comfortable in. But think if this were a stone model, where would you trim this model to? You want your vestibular fold. You want to maintain that. All right, so I'll just hit delete periodically. I'm going to show you a trick for little areas like this when you're trying to clean up models. For right now, I'm just going to go around and do some of these areas where it's a nice big vestibular fold. Hit delete. So I think that I have separated this. Okay, I haven't. What I just did is I hit E, which is expand to connected, and what I'm realizing now is I haven't trimmed this one enough. Okay, because it's still connected up here. All right, so a lot of times, actually I'm going to undo that. A lot of times you get in an area like this and you want to start trimming, all right, to right there. But that spot size has bleed over, and I don't want to lose actually this part. So what are my options? I could go with a little bitty spot size, right? And that's kind of a pain in the butt, right? So I could do it real fine tuning like that, or you're using this. One reason I like Meshmixer, and I realize not everyone's going to push through and learn Meshmixer to the degree I have, but I'll give you some reasons why you should. With your select tool, you've got what's called a crease angle threshold. All right, if I just bump that up, I want you to watch. I can make a huge spot size now and no bleed over. Why is that? Well, because it's looking for a crease in the model, right? And if it finds a sharp, hard edge like that, it's not going to roll over that. All right, so same thing right here. I'm trying to break that apart. Look, no bleed over. All right, so now
makes it real easy for me to just hit delete on that. And then anywhere else that has those sharp little PVS fins that I need to clean up, I'm going to go ahead and repeat that. All right. And you're sometimes going to get little isolated triangles like that. Again, I'm more proficient in Meshmixer. I could just say shift greater than. That's expand ring. All of these I use hotkeys, but look, expand the ring is right here, greater than sign. So that tells you where the hotkeys are. So now I can hit delete on that. And I would imagine now when I say expand to connected, it is disconnected from that. All right, so I'm going to go to under edit, there's separate, that's Y. I'm going to hit the hotkey Y. And now do you see how this is broken apart? It's its own STL. I don't necessarily want to delete this yet because I might want to maintain the teeth on the buckle here. But for right now, I'm going to hide that. Now another thing, this model is inside out from what I need it to be. So I'm going to select all. The hotkey for that is Control A. Under Edit, there is Flip Normals. So now I've got a right side out model. And then I find a lot of times I need to kind of do some model editing now. Okay, so we've got the question, do we want to try and engage all that stuff? If so, that big missing gap there is going to be a problem. Well, maybe I could trick this a little bit. What if so now I need to get rid of that crease angle. What if I selected there and hit Control B? That is bridge. Now, is that truly where her tissue is? I doubt it, but it's going to be pretty close. And it is a denture, so we're going to be able to come back and check that with PIP or whatever your method is, and do some intraoral checking of how accurate that is. I can use smoothing tools, right? So I might smooth this out a little bit. If you got a big hole you're trying to fill, if I just double click this boundary, see how it's selected the whole boundary, I can hit F. F is erase and fill. And thing I like about that for repairing models is this bulge slider, so I could drag that in and out. That looks like that's probably somewhat realistic. And again, this is guesswork for me. It's an educated guess, but I would rather err towards making some little prematurities in this denture, maybe engaging some undercuts and stuff, because it's real easy to adjust on this denture and dial it in on the intaglio fit. But if you just don't engage it in the first place, you kind of got problems. All right, I'm seeing that little area right there. I probably want to trim that a little bit more. I'll delete that. Might delete some of these narrow creases. All right, and then I don't like anywhere that is rolling over like that. Get it where you can see it. I don't like that, so I'm just going to delete that because you're probably not going to be able to engage that with your denture anyway. And then as long as I keep the strength low on this, I can smooth out some boundaries on my denture. Or I guess this is my master model. So I'm just doing a little model prepping before I'm taking these models into design. If you get those little crease things from where PVS kind of overlapped itself during border molding, maybe you clean that up a little bit. So you can do as much as you want with brushes. Like that's probably artifact. That was a salivary gland or something, I would bet. You could also just zoom in here and double click that boundary. Right, so I've got the entire boundary selected, and I could just hit smooth boundary. How much do you want to smooth it? You know, you got all these thresholds and things you can do. All right, so there's, I would function with that as a lower master model. So I'm going to save this real quick. We'll call it lower master model. Now I need to kind of do the same thing for the upper. All right. So I'm not going to talk on this one as much. I'm going to just do it and get the job done. So I'll time lapse this. All right, so once again, I've got that trimmed. I'm going to select it all and flip the normals so that it's a master model now. Okay. Show you a little trick here. You're almost always, when you take impressions, you're going to get little areas where salivary glands create like this positive little defect. You might get gaps where you know, your impression material didn't come together. So let's go back to where this is all one color. You've got a cool feature in Meshmixer that you can do where it's you could say edit and generate face groups. All right, now what is that doing? You might see a couple little isolated spots where it's turned it a different color. But what I want to do is basically make all these little blebs and things stand out. All right, well, similar to that select threshold, you see here there's an angle threshold. So what if I made a lower angle threshold? Let's make it like 6 or something. I'm just guessing at that number. You see what just happened? Any little blebs and stuff kind of pop out because it's going from this relatively smooth and then it's hitting this rough right angle or something, or whatever angle. I can utilize that feature to quickly isolate these things. So now I don't want to go around and select all this stuff. The way I do it is I'll say, let me double click this face group and then hit I, which is invert. Again, all this stuff is in the menus if you dig. I'm going to use hotkeys. And then I'm going to create a face group out of all the things that are selected. That hotkey is Control G. All right, and just so you can contrast these colors easier, I'm going to make this something very different. There we go. So now it makes it easy. I want to get rid of that, that. And I'll go ahead and just find all of these little blebs that I think are more artifact than real. And once I've selected them all, I can just erase and fill them real quick. And not every single one of these is an artifact. Sometimes it's just a harsh angle that's, you know, I think is their real anatomy. So there's some guesswork in this. But again, we're playing a game of microns here, and dentures don't have to be quite that accurate. You know, that's not a game changer. So let's say I choose all of these. All right. Now that I've got those selected, I could just on my keyboard say F, which is erase and fill. And now those are gone. All right. So a nice way to clean your models up. That's just a feature I'm not going to find in any other CAD software, be it Blue Sky, 3Shape, ExoCAD. None of them are really going to have something like that. So there's some value in learning some of these things. I'm going to check for holes. I don't want to close the hole inside here, so there was one little defect. Now, how far back do I want to bring my palatal area? So I'm going to just get rid of the colors now. Control A, Control G means just make this all one face group. All right. So let's mark our hamular notches, right? that would be a hamular notch, and that's a hamular notch. I can make a face group out of them. How far anterior do I want to bring this? Probably to this, barely distal to that, the fovea palatinae, which are those little glandular structures right here at the back midline of the palate to either side. And you can kind of see where the previous denture tray was following that same path. I don't really need to bring my master model, much beyond that. So what I'm going to do is just use a lasso tool, and I'm going to leave it a little bit excessive so that, when I'm designing and drawing my boundary on the denture, I'm not going to necessarily just like fall off the model, but I'm not going to bring my denture back more than that. Okay, so that looks good. And then maybe I want to smooth the boundary. I double click that whole boundary, maybe expand the ringer time or two, and then hit B, which is smooth boundary again. So this is looking like a much cleaner master model. I'll save it. So I'm going to export and call this upper master model. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to need as I'm designing, remember when we're right here, we've already done some of this work to, analyze, okay, this is where her current is, which we have scanned, and I need to be able to visualize that so I know where to move things to. All right, so when you go about scanning this, it's always going to generate at least 3 STLs. One of those is going to be labeled total jaw, at least in the shining scanner we were using. That's your buccal bite. All right, so now look at what we've got. We've got this upper master model, which I've trimmed up and created. We've got the lower master model, but then we've also got this. All right, that is our buccal bite. Now, whatever PVS we used, I was apparently sloppy and I didn't trim that, and I really kind of want to see these full contour teeth. So I could extrapolate from this and still see, I know the midline is right there even though it's covered up. But remember what else you've got, right? In the process of trimming these things, I separated them, but I didn't discard that other stuff. I've still got this. Okay, that shows the teeth great. So maybe I just want to get rid of those floating bits. So I can click on this one. E is expanded, connected, invert, and delete all those floaters. And then same thing here. I could click on this, E, and it's not separating anything. Why? Because it's still connected back here. Well, all of that is just noise. I don't need it. In fact, I don't need anything but the buckle of the teeth, so I could just delete all that. Now what would happen if I click here, E, invert, delete? So I've got that and that. If I combine those, now I'm going to save that and call that my buccal bite. So I've spent however much time doing this. I'm going slow because I'm talking, but also it's going to make my end result a lot better. This is the equivalent time you would spend of getting clean cast and, grinding off blebs and artifacts and all that kind of stuff. We're doing all the same stuff in a digital workflow that we would with a analog workflow. Okay, so I was about to launch my design software, but I remembered one thing that I like to do. Again, do you have to do this? No. I'm going to try to give you as many options as possible, but you remember our template that we made here? Like, yes, I could during my design constantly be referencing back and forth to this. It's nice though if you can just stay within the CAD program and not have to be clicking in and out, looking at pictures and all that kind of stuff. So what I can do is I can build a little 3D grid of, I call it my tooth setting planes. So I'm looking right now, where is the midline where I want it to be versus where it is here. Let's just go make that. All right, so in Meshmixer, again, I don't know another program that you can do this as efficiently in. I can grab a plane. I'm going to pull this thing over, get it in the ballpark of my stuff here. And then I've got real fine control over this. Alright, where do I want the midline of this new denture to be? And I can just do my glancing back and forth at these pictures right now and say, okay, that looks like it's right there on that incisal edge. So maybe a little more that way. Does that look like where we had her facial midline lined up? I mean, to me it does. All right. You could always turn on, say, your maxillary cast and look at, like, how does that compare to her midline ref A? So a facial scan would be better for this, but I don't have a facial scan here, so if I wanted to kind of set it to the midline of her palatal anatomy, right, that would go maybe there. But then let's again turn back on this buccal bite that we had generated. And looky there. If we had just used her palatal references, right, so you see how I'm coming almost through the middle of her papilla and through the midline raphe of her palate, that almost corresponds to where I had the midline just, based on the pictures. And now that doesn't always happen. There's asymmetries that happen in the palate, but I'm pretty darn close with that. What about the canting that we saw? I thought it was too high on this side, too low on this side. So let's make a horizontal reference plane. I'm going to duplicate this and hit transform and just turn it 90 degrees. So here I've got real fine control, right? I can go in hundredths of a millimeter, but also if you hover on those hash marks, it lets you do exact degrees of reference. And so that's a straight 90 degree. And I forgot even what I said. So it's too low on this side. Does that correspond to what I'm seeing here? I look pretty symmetric with that current denture, so I'd probably want to bring her occlusal plane down on this side, up on this side a little bit, which looks like I've kind of done there. Alright. And if you're intent on keeping these totally squared, once again I could go edit, duplicate, and just now spin it back the other way is 90 degrees. Alright, is that about where we had her midline? It's maybe right there based on the facial pictures. So that looks pretty good. What about her occlusal plane this way? If I'm looking at, occlusal plane coming 2/3 up the retromolar pad, then that probably needs to come up a little bit. Alright, like this way. So this is not an exact science. Remember, I also said I wanted to bring her incisal edge maybe up a little bit based on the pictures. And I might start to question that and think, that may be an appropriate incisal edge if all the other stuff was lined out. So what would it look like if I put the incisal edge roughly in the same spot? Now we're getting pretty close to an occlusal plane. So that's same incisal edge, and it's still maybe a little too abrupt. Maybe it needs to go like that. But all of these are general guidelines. Okay, if I hid that, does that look like a pretty appropriate occlusal plane? You know, there's some educated guesswork. If I had facial planes, I would have this thing dialed in, and it's like put the teeth right on this plane. All right, but I'm kind of fudging. So it looks like this is way too exaggerated and these mandibular teeth were way too high. Do I see that here? It's not blatantly obvious to me, but I do think the maxillary incisors are a bit too high back there. All right, just so happens I took more pictures. More pictures is always better than fewer, so let's insert another picture. So what I'm doing now is I'm looking at her allotragus line. So tip of the tragus to ala of the nose. If you've messed that one up, you could just right click, say copy, and paste another one so that it's perfectly parallel. And I actually don't think the occlusal plane is that far off. All right, I do think, the cheeks are hiding some of this. It does look like this is starting to go up, that's starting to go up. So yes, I do need to bring maxillary teeth down, but this might be too exaggerated. So let's say we go with that as our occlusal plane. You can definitely see that molars are coming above it, and you always can jump back and forth and look. I'm thinking that looks like a good estimation of where her occlusal plane ought to go. Once again, now this would probably only bother me, but it bothers me that these planes aren't squared up. So at any point I can just take one and duplicate it, transform it, and just spin it 90 to that. All right, you don't have to do that. What if we wanted to create a reference for how far out her incisors need to go? If I'm looking at this, I think actually the facial aspect of the incisors is pretty good. So I don't need to change that. But just to show you it as a reference, let's say that I'm looking at it and it's way far back here, and I wanted to say, okay, I want that, 4 millimeters anterior. Just play with these planes as much as you want to. That one I could duplicate, transform it, and spin it a 90. Get on that snapping line. And if I'm just looking for an anterior reference for where to facially put the incisal edge, I don't need this thing to be big. Could maybe go there, and then turn back on that buccal bite. So if I want to replicate that, I could say, okay, when you start designing, you're going to drop the teeth. The incisal edge of 8 and 9 will go right where these were, but you're going to move your midline here, and you want to set your general occlusal plane here. And we can make as many of these references as you want, like canine to canine. Let's do that. Okay. What would I use to reference my canine tips? Well, there's you can jump on ChatGPT and pull up all the denture articles, uh, and say, give me a reference for where does where do the canine tips generally rest relative to maxillary anatomy. One of the studies I read recently said that it will fall on an aesthetic looking smile on a plane that goes right through the distal of their incisive papilla. So, again, is this an absolute? No. But there's her distal over incisive papilla. And then I can just pull that back down and say, okay, canine cusp tips should fall where these planes intersect, which is going to put the cusp tips right there. Okay, what about canine to canine reference? We did this in 2D, going back here. The canine on her right side should go approximately where that canine currently is. So all I'm doing is duplicating planes. Transform, I'm going to pull one over. I can scale it, whatever I need to do. But what becomes my reference? I've always got this known of the picture that I'm thinking back to. So I could say maybe canines are going to go right there. I don't have to have these things be enormous like they are here. Scale it to whatever degree you want. Alright, I'll accept that. So again, where will canine cusp tips be? They're going to be, the distal aspect's going to go right there. The tips ought to fall on the plane and on this line. And then I need to create this same thing on this side. And that side was off. So maybe I just take this one and I duplicate it. T for transform. It's going to be somewhere over here. But what's my reference? Well, based on this PowerPoint smile analysis, that seemed crazy to me that it would go that much further over. But if these teeth were scaled too narrow to start with, maybe that's the case. So what if I put it right here? I think that's got to be my eye tricking me. I can't imagine we need to go beyond about this second premolar area right here, because she definitely needs her buccal corridors filled out as well. So a broader arch will help. So how far over do I bring it? If we went with that picture solely, it would be right there. But that just seems crazy to me. So I'm thinking symmetry. That looks pretty symmetrical, and in fact that does seem to line up with about the middle of that second premolar. Alright, all of this is subject to change. So you don't have to do all this again, but I want to remove as much guesswork and just eyeballing things as possible. So I've created all these planes in this grid and everything, right? And right now they're individual planes here. If I just select them all, I can combine them into one, and I'm going to save that as my tooth setting planes. So now I'm going to go ahead and design this denture. I've shown some designs recently in ExoCAD, so let's switch it up and let's go blue sky on this one. All of these CAD programs are going to have things that they do better, things that they do worse. ExoCAD's got a far better tooth setting chain and making fine movements with cusps and getting occlusion dialed in. I don't like the bases ExoCAD generates. It wants to block out all the undercuts. You can only maintain undercuts up to 0.5 millimeter. Well, dentures, we want to maintain more undercuts than that. That seems like a crazy parameter that they don't let you override. If someone knows how to do that, please tell me. Blue Sky is going to allow you to pretty much keep as much undercut as you want. There's pros and cons to both. So I've launched the denture module. I'm going to say let's import our models. So whereas exocad, for example, and I don't know, maybe 3Shape 2 individually prompt you to bring in models, with Blue Sky, what I want to do is just prompt it to bring in all the models associated with this case all at once. Because right now they're currently oriented to one another correctly. So I want that buckle bite. I want the lower model, master model, the upper master model, and I want to bring in those tooth setting planes that I generated. So I control selected them, bringing them all in at once. So every CAD program is initially going to want you to orient your models to its understanding of here's the top of the head, here's the bottom. Let's say that we're going to align, we could pick any of these. I'm going to align this maxillary model. So it's selected in blue. It's a maxilla and it's an edentulous arch. So now that's going to kind of say, okay, I know where to identify things. So as the models stand currently, you see how it's upside down from Blue Sky's understanding, which is here's the face, that's the top of the head. We've got to make these coincide. So the way Blue Sky prompts you, it says hold down the shift key, click in this hamular notch, click on the incisive papilla. I'm just shift left clicking, click on the other hamular notch, and now it's made those match up. I'll continue. And now you can see if I say show all the models, they're all lined up, all right, including my tooth grid and everything else. So you could have just used Blue Sky's tooth grid to do this, but I added a bunch of extra stuff. So I'm going to just go with this, click finish, and now we're into the program. All right, so hopefully now you're going to see where some of the payoff is in that time that I spent on the front end making those tooth setting planes and everything. I don't need to do any model editing because, I could have done it here, but again, I chose to do it in Meshmixer here just because that's my comfort level. I can just be more efficient and use some weird little tricks I know that makes it happen faster. Let's now just go to Denture Design. All right. Right off the bat, it wants us to insert a tooth library. I like this Mitchhurst library. I'll just use that. Select all these teeth. And here's what I don't remember is, was there plenty of room for second molars in this? And I don't remember the answer to that. I kind of anticipate that we're going to be struggling for room on this side. I might initially just go with first molars forward. So I'm going to control and deselect my seconds. And now just shift and drop your chain of teeth in. Now these teeth are preset. I like this over exocad, to be real honest, because exocad you got to set one arch to completion, then set your opposing arch to completion. It does not do great with just bringing everything in where it's all set up together. So let's get everything squared up to the grid that we made. All right, facial aspect of these teeth is going right there. Midline of these teeth is going right there. They should be approximately on this plane. And then, Control Z. And then more or less following this plane. Now there's a little bit of a curve of speed built into these teeth, so I may not do this exactly where my plane is. Again, I'm using this as a general guide, not an absolute thing. If at any point you want to make this transparent. Now what about my tooth scaling? in my denture design panel, I've got scalers that just scale the teeth up and down. So what was my reference for how big to make her anterior teeth width-wise? Here's my canine plane for the distal of the canines. So I'm going to scale that down just a bit. That's pretty close. Alright, distal of canine, distal of canine. I like that. And according to, that plane coming through the back edge of her incisive papilla, the tips ought to be right where those intersect. And mine are tucked back a little bit. And so maybe I move them out there, or maybe I'll look at it and say, no, I think that's pretty well coinciding with where I would expect that tooth to emerge out of the maxilla. So again, general guide. It just so happens that if I'm just looking at, let's only focus on the maxilla for right now. All right, if I looked at those maxillary teeth, would I expect those to be coming out of her natural ridge at about that trajectory? And I kind of would. She's had some resorption here, but that looks, especially in that area, but that looks feasible. If she had a full healthy ridge, I bet that canine would be coming out about right there. So there's been a loss of vertical height, and think of how a maxilla resorbs. It resorbs up and back, right? It's going to get narrower, and it's going to go back, towards the base of their spine. The mandible, as it resorbs, it's going to resorb that valvular bone, and as the mandible gets more resorbed, it's coming down and forward. So you'll get less ridge height, but it will move more to the chin bone, which is sticking out further. Okay, so she's definitely had some of that. Been some resorption there. So I'm kind of liking where the maxillary teeth are. All right, I can do individual tooth movements, like I kind of want these kicked in a little bit more. And if my plane is true, that one needs to come down a little bit. And remember how we had her plane was too low on this side. So if I did a good job of lining up that plane, it looks like I'm still wanting to replicate that. Which makes me think like whoever designed the one that was problematic was probably looking at these casts thinking the same thing, because they didn't have a phased treatment plan to. They were probably only able to deal with models that were in front of them. So I can't overstate the value that pictures are going to bring to this. So you see where I've put these teeth initially? That canine has fallen pretty much right where the incisal edge is falling right here, but this one is off that plane. So maybe I'm going to bring it down a little bit, which means I'm probably going to need to bring this lateral down a bit too. I always want to keep symmetry with my central incisors, but you can fudge everything else. I can move the entire tooth chain a bit just to get my midline kicked back over right there. And when I'm referencing this horizontal plane, I want to make sure those centrals are really good, because that's what's going to kick off the aesthetics more than anything else, is if the centrals are not in the correct inclination and in the correct, midline of the face. I think that midline is good. Go back to how you were taught to set denture teeth in school. Here's your horizontal plane that they're taught to do with interpupillary allotragus. And dental school, they're going to teach you put the canine tips and the central tips on the plane, put your lateral's 1/2 millimeter off. I'm going to go with that. That looks pretty good. All right. And so I've got my width scaled. So I think this is pretty good. And if I look at that, do I need a second molar? Probably not. I think I'm going to forego second molars here. All right. So I think the plane has done a nice job here. So now, remember, your ridges on an edentulous patient, upper and back, down and forward. In my experience, it's pretty important that you need to get the mandibular teeth over the top of the ridge. And the number one thing that's jumping out to me right now is that these anteriors are lingual to the ridge. And I think that's going to probably cost a little stability with this denture. All right. So I'm going to do some individual tooth movements. And this, I'll say, is a place where exocad is superior because their tooth chain functionality for changing inclinations and all that kind of stuff and seeing the occlusion is a lot more refined. But, you know, here we just don't have that. We do have a tooth chain that makes it nice for gross movements, but my posterior teeth seem to be pretty good over the ridge. That, to me, looks like that's probably where these teeth would be emerging out of the ridge, but these anteriors are not. So rather than use the chain, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just individually say manipulate models, and I think all of these anterior teeth are going to need to get rotated. All right, so probably more like that and brought buccally as if they're coming out of this ridge. And then I'll reference that with this one and try to kind of do the same thing, just eyeballing it. And I'm not paying a lot of attention right now to the incisal edge and screwing up occlusion. I'll show you how I'll deal with that in a moment. So see how that looks like that could be coming out of that ridge. Canines don't look like they're much of an issue, so I'm not going to screw with them a lot. Alright, I did get my midline a little bit off, and so I'm going to pull these over. I'm not worrying about scaling the teeth right now either. And this model's, now that I've kind of got them where I want them, I don't have to see the visibility of that model. I could either make it transparent or hide it entirely. I think this tooth is going to need to come this way a little, but I'm going to have some gaps to close. So I'm going to do some of this gross tooth movement, and right now I'm just kind of individually setting denture teeth, which hopefully is somewhat familiar to you. So I'll time lapse it. I'll mention here real quick, I'm opening up some gaps here. So if I needed to close this gap here, I could just stretch it with that node. And maybe I do part of it with one tooth, part of it with the other. Here I've got a bigger one. Close half of it there, and then half of it here. All right, so I think I've mostly got my maxillary teeth where I would want them. One thing I haven't really looked at was the heights of the teeth. Let's talk, and I could have made a plane for this as well, but she's got a pretty hypermobile and a short upper lip, so I think she's probably got the gingival margin at roughly the right level on that try-in that we did that was problematic. So where was it here? And we're not far off of it, so I'm not going to change much with that. But I didn't really know that until I checked it. All right, so the kind of final step, as I've tweaked these things around, I know for a fact I've probably messed up the occlusion. And again, this closeness thing right here is it's a function for checking occlusion, but it's kind of a memory hog, and it's going to struggle a little bit more. So I would recommend, that you just do your occlusion check the way I'm about to show you. It's a little bit of a pain, but it's not that bad. So we do have all of these sliders up here. So if I wanted to, for example, take all of these mandibular teeth off the table, I can just deselect that. So none of them are visible here. I like to change them all to a different color. I'm going to make these all green because I'm kind of assuming that I like where teeth are now and for the maxilla. And now I'm going to adjust my mandibular teeth to that. Because your maxilla drives your aesthetics. Your mandible, for the most part, is going to be driving function. And hopefully this will be clear why I'm doing this in a moment. All right, I've got them, the arches are different colors. Now I'm one by one going to go ahead and toggle the transparency on my maxillary teeth. And unfortunately, you can't just do the whole arch at once. And all of this stuff is little, issues that we're going to fix eventually in subsequent versions, but it's going to take time to do it. All right. So now I'm going to be able to tell really easily, okay, that tooth's in hyperocclusion. You see that? And so now it makes it a lot easier with this global deforming tool to start tweaking things like occlusion. This molar is out of occlusion, so I can maybe bring it up until I start to see that and then just pull it back a little bit. All right. That looks good. So I'm going to just do this and start making some gross movements. There's hyperocclusion. Pull it back. Here's hyperocclusion. And I might even opt to just do this, which is just into hyperocclusion, and then show you there's not a great option for just, hey, cut back the occlusion to the opposing. At least not as clean as, maybe some other softwares, but there is a way to do it. So I'm going to do that in this case and show you how I would address that. I think these need to be rotated up a little, pulled over. But they're still in hyperocclusion. You can always go back just a hair, but remember, I'm kind of trying to cheat this into making it where those teeth are somewhat coming out of the mandibular ridge, getting them centered over that. that canine could come out a little bit. I don't even have to have that maxillary model on right now because I kind of set my maxillary teeth to where I want them. There's no need to be messing with that still. All right. Now, just so you know that this is an option, if you need to like individually do fine tooth movements, you can do that. It's just not in the denture module. It's in crown and bridge. So for example, in crown and bridge, I've got individual smooth, global geometry, add, remove, right? So let's say if I took a remove tool here and I select this molar, right, there's my add, remove, and I could just erase it back a little bit. So maybe I'm going to come around and just do an individual single click on each of these hyperocclusion spots. And I could just as well be doing this on the maxillary arch. That's really up to you. But I do try to get it kind of close with the global positioning stuff and then leave it where I'm just doing real fine stuff with these tools. And you can also use smooth. All right, I think we're pretty close on that. We're still in hyperocclusion places, and I'm doing that intentionally because I want to show you the other option. All right, we've got our teeth mostly set at this point. If I turn on the master models, oh, I've got the selector there. I'm generally good with that setup, despite the little bit of hyperocclusion. So at this point, I'm ready to make dentures. So under denture design, we don't need to set teeth again. So we're ready to pick an arch, the maxillary denture. So I want to build a maxillary denture on this upper master model. I'm going to click Create Denture, and this is going to launch a kind of a wizard workflow. I don't really need to see that blue model. It's kind of in my way. So step one, this is your path of insertion. You can play with the slider and stuff, but usually what I'm going to do is just kind of look down on the model, try to minimize undercuts if I can, and say select my insertion from this view. So when I clicked that, now the only things that are undercut are what you're seeing in dark brown. And here, I hope someone from Exocad watches this. A denture, you want to maintain your undercuts. Okay, you can adjust it in. You would rather maintain the undercuts because it'll squish past on soft tissue. Exocad's only going to allow you to do a maximum of 1/2 of a millimeter of undercut. Well, that's crazy. With Blue Sky, I can engage up to 5 millimeters of undercut, which is much more in keeping with what I want to do. So again, I've got my insertion direction, and yes, those are undercut, but that's not a 5 millimeter undercut because you wouldn't be able to squish it past a 5 millimeter undercut. So I'm going to click Next, Do I want to do a posterior palatal seal? We could do that right now as well. So I can click that. When I do, it's going to prompt me drop a point with the shift and left click in each of the hamular notches. All right, and it will just superimpose this line. Now you can take that line and you can drag it with more of a bow. So remember, where does the posterior border go? Kind of on those fovea palatinae, right in there. We could play with all these sliders. How much do we want to go into the tissue and all that kind of stuff? And you can adjust your lines too by clicking on the shift. I like to go out a little to the outside of my hamular notches. All right, that to me looks pretty good. And the thickness right now is set at 2. I'd rather go too thick because it's easy to buzz back. So I'm going to click now. So what it's doing right now, it's blocking out undercuts, and it's going to build in this posterior palatal seal with kind of the direction that we've got indicated at the moment. So yes, it's blocked out undercuts on the edges, but notice that was marked as an undercut and it hasn't blocked that out because Blue Sky is going to allow an undercut up to 5 millimeters. Well, that's great because exocad does not allow that. I keep saying exocad because that's the other design software I'm familiar with. I just can't speak much to 3Shape or InLab or some of the others. Step 2, define your denture base. So we're going to go ahead now and define where do you want the border of your denture to be. I'm just shift left clicking. Make sure your last node joins with the first one. You're fully into your borders wherever you want. If you need to add a node, shift left click in it. And then all of these you can fine tune. Again, on borders, I'd rather go a bit long because trimming back is a piece of cake, but adding to them is not easy in any software. So I'm going to go with that. Let's click next. By the way, you've got your gingival margin thickness, your overall dent thickness. If I have one like this where the teeth are not impinging in the ridge, I'm going to go with the default of 3 millimeter gingiva thickness. Something like an emit where you're fighting space, I'll probably go 2, maybe even 1.5. All right, so here is your initial gingival design. And you can see it's one and the same here. It does not do, unless you tell it to, it doesn't build in an offset. It's not smoothing the intaglio like exocad forces. I prefer the intaglio Blue Sky for the undercut reason and because it doesn't apply some smoothing algorithm and offset. I want it one and the same because that's what I get if I send it for conventional processing on a stone model. Is the most intimate fit to that tissue. All right. The initial gingival proposal is not as good in Blue Sky. All right. It's always going to look rough like this, and I just accept that I'm going to have to take a minute. I'm going to use the smooth tool with the maximum strength, and I'm going to just start by smoothing this thing out. All right, so I have smoothed the heck out of this, right? And, to me, it already looks significantly better, but I also know that there's going to be significant areas where I need to add, remove. If you need to do a lot of addition, this local deform is very quick and easy to use because I can just basically drag my entire spot size up and out or whatever direction I need to do that. So if I'm making big gross changes, this is the tool to go to. All right, if I look at it on the buckle, you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. If you wanted like a root prominence, get a spot size the width of that tooth, and then you can just pull that out. I need quite a bit of addition on this canine neck. All right, that looks halfway decent. That's a no frills gingival design. Do you want to get fancier? You could use the add and remove tool. I tend to use this on a much lower strength, and maybe I'm just going to inflate right around the necks of the teeth. So I'm trying not to add necessarily material on the tooth itself, more of like a raised gingival margin. If you overdo it like I did right there, that's not a big deal. You can smooth that back out. So that looks a little better contoured. Now the question becomes, how much time do you want to spend on this? Because if you wanted to characterize your gingiva and stuff, honestly, you're better off to leave this, it's not a cutback, but less filled out, and give yourself room that you can apply some stains. Maybe do like Wally Renee's candy coat technique where you add additional resin over that. I do that pretty often. Or maybe use some gingival composites. If you've brought it to the absolute full contour, then anything beyond that you add is going to overbulk it. So I tend to not spend a ton of time doing gingival festooning and stuff, so that I've got some room that I can characterize it. And sometimes that characterization is just taking a syringe and sucking up some extra liquid denture-based material, flowing it on, like curing it, and getting contour that way. You don't always have to do everything digital. So I like that. Let's now click next. So this last step, 404, tooth offset. How much of think of cement spacer. You got to bond these teeth in. How much of a gap do you want between the teeth and the denture base? I'll leave that at 0.2. But what I do always alter is what is the thinnest you want this denture to be? Like imagine under sockets, right? So I don't really even have teeth impinging here, but let's imagine that tooth was impinging in here. Well, the tooth has to get trimmed back. What's the thinnest you want the pink denture base to end up anywhere? For purposes of printing, I like to set this at 0.5, all right? And so I'll slide that up to 0.5, which means Anywhere a tooth is impinging, it's going to offset this intaglio by 0.5 millimeter, cut the teeth back to there, and that's going to ensure that your final denture base with sockets in it doesn't have any holes, because I hate it when I design the base and now there's this little pinpoint hole through it where resin's going to get in there and it's a pain in the butt to the bonding process. So I think I would go with that. All right, let's make sure I haven't overbulked the gingiva, and I don't think I might have actually overbulked it a little bit here. So maybe I'll, you know what, I'm going to do that with a burr. I don't even care about that. But I do set this to 0.2 and 0.5, and then I'm going to connect my teeth into a single STL file. I like this better on Blue Sky, that I don't have to screw with individual connectors and stuff and moving them all around, and then they never seem to cooperate and combine into one watertight file in Exocad. This I like better in Blue Sky. So I'm going to click next, and this will take a minute to a minute and a half to process, so I'll time lapse it. All right, there's my finalized base with sockets. Let me make this transparent so you can see it. Do you see the sockets within the denture base now? I could even just hide the teeth. Now in my objects browser, the only things showing are this denture dash fin, that's the base with sockets, and then my connected teeth. Those are all one STL file now. But there is my finalized denture base. No smoothing like Exocad wants to do, no offsetting unless you told it to. And then I've got my trimmed tooth chain, and it didn't trim anything, but it did build in connectors. Do you see those? And those just happen, and they do nice, unlike Exocad where I've got to drag around connectors and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we've got all of that done now, and I'm finished with the upper. Now I'm going to really fast time lapse the whole lower, because I've got to go back and do that as well. So this time I'm doing lower master model. It's a mandibular denture, but I'm going to time lapse it. Okay, mandible's done. Now I know the question's going to come like, hey, what about, basically what happened here is I defined my margin so close to the border that it kind of fell off and you get these little spikes. I'm not worried about that. That's real quick and easy to deal with. Like in your Model Master module, you can just simply cut that off, right? So here, I'm going to just say under model editing, I'm going to use, or actually I'm going to go to surfaces panel and say cut, and I'm going to just cut off this, and I'm not even really worried about doing a very good job with it. Oh, I got to click this. Tell it what model we're cutting on. Because again, I expect to do a little polishing, and so if I have a little bleb or something, I'll just polish that off. And now we're pretty well done there. So the last thing I would do before exporting all this, because I mentioned it to you earlier, what if I wanted to cut in the occlusion? Well, now this becomes a lot easier because we have all of the teeth as one STL file. So you could just do a straight Boolean cut from, the upper tooth chain to the lower tooth chain. So for example, here I'm going to hide every model except for my two connected teeth bases. All right, so connected teeth right there. And just so you can appreciate which one's which. So there's my mandible connected teeth. And remember how I left a little hyperocclusion? These are still unedited. You see the hyperocclusion there, and there, and there. So in crown and bridge design, you have Boolean functions. It's under the tooth editing panel right here, and then it's this little collapsed menu. So let's say if I wanted to do a Boolean difference, and I want to subtract from my upper teeth, which are connected teeth here, I want to subtract my lower connected teeth, which I had in blue, plus or minus an offset. So if you're familiar with exocad, when it cuts in occlusion, it defaults to do 1/10 of a millimeter, so I could say 0.1 here. So let's zoom in on this spot right here. Watch that, and I'm going to apply it. All right, now it still looks like it's there, right? But that's simply because whereas exocad just takes it away and it's gone, Blue Sky is going to generate an additional surface now. So you still have the original that was in hyperocclusion, but now you have this one. All right, and that looks like a giant crater to your eye. Think how much zoomed in you are right now compared to that real tooth, right? You'll barely be able to see that. So you can see some little marks here where I've cut in occlusion because I left it too high, but that's all good. We're fine with that. So now I'm finished. I want to export everything I've designed. And I truly mean I'm going to export everything I've designed. I'm going to do the base with sockets, the base without sockets for upper and lower. I'm also going to do my buckle bite, my master model, my tooth setting planes, all that stuff. I don't necessarily need that undercut model because I allowed all the undercuts. If I go now to File, Export Data, all right, I want to export all of those files as individual files separated within a folder. I don't want them all as one giant STL of tons of layers. So I'm going to say export them separated to files. Tells me you're going to deduct one export. So in my patients folder, I'll create a new folder called Blue Sky Denture Design. I'll tell it that's where I want these to go, export it, and now it's going to export all those models. See how all these are getting dropped in there? Now, why did I export the models and stuff? Because let's say if I just exported my design and then I wanted to look at it on my original master model. Remember, in every CAD program, your first step is you reorient your models to that program's understanding of up, down, side to side. So they're going to be different now from where your original model is. So let's just take a quick look at one of these. That's my maxillary teeth chain. I'm just opening it in Meshmixer. All right, and then my, so remember when you're looking at these, denture base is one thing. Denture dash final is the one that has had the sockets built in. Why did I do the one that has no sockets built in? Because if I want to do a monolithic denture, for example, let's look at those. See how this base has no sockets, but it has my posterior palatal seal, it has all that stuff? Well, what's a monolithic denture? It's those two combined. So now I could also just save this as upper monolithic. I could do the same with the lower. I'm not going to build this patient a monolithic denture, but I'm just showing you that that's a possibility. So bottom line, we've gotten to the end of this process. It's taken way longer than it would have if I was just doing this. All right, so don't get the impression that designing dentures takes this long. It doesn't, but the reality is there is no one denture design program that does everything ideally. Blue Sky's got its issues and strong points. So does Exocad, so does 3Shape. And, you know, I kind of pick whichever one I want based on how I'm feeling that day and whatever else. But the point is you can get there in all of these. So sorry for the long video, but it's free, so quit complaining. So hope you found that helpful. Talk to you later.